CGI gives filmmakers enormous creative freedom and often saves producers a lot of time and money during production. The 3D animators who deliver and create these animated characters often draw on the mocap or motion capture data that's been created by actors. I have the pleasure today of speaking to Lyndall Grant. She's one of Australia's most respected combat directors, movement director, actor and motion capture specialist. If you've ever wanted to perform in one of those suits with the ping pong balls all over them, or to be a dragon on screen, sit tight and enjoy the chat. Hi, welcome Lyndall. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So you've got many roles. One is a movement director, also an actor and a motion capture specialist. Can you tell us a little bit about some of your roles and the pathways that took you to them?
Yeah, so I've, like a lot of people in the arts, I've had quite a meandering journey to where I am now. So I started off training as an actor in the UK. And when I was there, I got introduced to stage combat, which I just thought was one of the most exciting forms of performance. Through that, then I went, studied stage combat further, became a fight director and really specialised in movement performance, and then discovered motion capture through that. I've had a journey that's included working with traditional performance, but then also really specialising in things to do with movement, action, and creating creatures, creating characters, and that became my specialty. So it's not something I expected I was ever going to do, but as always in the industry, you have to be quite agile and be ready for opportunities as they come. So it's pretty exciting.
It sounds amazing. It sounds like my dream job. So do you cross over theatre, film, television, like across all formats?
Yes, I work in all of those. I mean, at the moment, more recently, I've been doing much more theatre. And in terms of film, usually most of my film work would be in a motion capture context. But it just depends what work's going. And I think that's what makes this career so exciting. It's because you're always adapting and looking for new opportunities.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about mocap and performance capture. So why do film productions use it?
So motion capture is the process of taking movement from an object or a person or an animal and translating that into a computer-generated image. When we talk about motion capture, usually we talk about the bigger movements of the body. And then now when we say performance capture, it's when we're talking about the more fine details of performance as well. So facial capture and perhaps fine details of the finger movements and more subtle movements. It's really widely used in film and television, lots of different applications. So you could do it to create a digital animated character, whether that's an animated character that's in an actual real film or whether it's an animated film. You could use it for stunts or for doubling. We can use it a lot for crowd scenes. You can do it when you create what we call motion capture agents, where they are each one little artificial intelligence character that can interact on their own, or you can actually just use it to create a crowd scene based on what you decide that you want the character to do. And we can use it for gaming as well. So it's got a lot of applications. It can be a very efficient way of creating animation because you can get one person in a motion capture suit and you can record a scene. You can do it lots of different times, lots of different versions, and then the creative team can decide what they want to use. Versus traditional animation where, of course, each time if you wanted to change it, you have to redraw it. So it has the benefit of being incredibly quick. It also picks up the really fine details and nuance of life. So when you are moving, you generally don't just move an arm. If you're moving an arm, something else in your body will move at the same time. We call that complementary movement. And motion capture picks that up really well. It also picks up really fine things like what happens when you breathe, what happens when you talk, and what we'd call the nuance of life. So it's a way of being efficient, but it's also a way of being very detailed and capturing life. Animation.
So the CG components of film production, as we've seen, has grown a lot. Has the mocap industry grown and has it changed a lot since you began?
Yeah, motion capture is this weird industry where it's really widely used, it's really quickly developed, and then a whole bunch of the industry has never used it before. So it's incredibly niche and incredibly widespread at the same time. The technology improves so quickly that every time I step back into a studio, there's something new and something that wasn't there before. In the early days, as an actor, there were things that you'd have to allow for with the technology. So, for example, when you're working in what we call an optical system, which is the images where you see where there's little shiny balls on the suit, those work because infrared cameras shoot light, which then bounce back and then get read by the computer. But if you cover those up, then that marker will drop off the system. So in the early days, you'd have to be very careful about how you move your body not to cover those markers. Now the systems are so intelligent that if a few markers drop off, the algorithms go, we think there should be a marker around there somewhere, we'll put one in there. So it's becoming more and more detailed and more flattering to the actor's performance. So there's less and less you have to think about in terms of the tech. I still feel there's things that you can do as an actor in a movement sense that actually really flatter the medium, but in the technical side, then there's less that you have to worry about. So it's becoming quicker. The improvements also mean there's less things that have to be corrected in post. So if you covered markers, or quite often markers will, if they're stuck on by Velcro, they might fall off or end up being stuck on another actor. That would need to be later on cleaned by the post-production team, and a few seconds of bad footage in the volume in the studio can translate to hours worth of cleaning later on. But now, again, the systems are becoming so intelligent that those kind of errors are less and less important.
And are the different systems, you were saying that was an optical or optic system? Yep. Are there other types of systems in mocap?
Yeah, so there's different kind of mocap systems. There's the two broad categories we'd use. One's called an inertial system and the other's an optical system. So within optical system, there's two main kinds of markers. So markers, what they are is we put them on certain areas of the body, which allows the computer to read where you're moving in space. So for example, if I put one there, there and there, as I move, we've got 3 points of reference, and the computer can go, I can read you on an X and a Y and a Z axis. So I can 3D movement. So there's two kinds of markers that would use. One's called a passive marker and one's called an active marker. A passive marker tends to be really reflective material, which reflects the infrared light that's bounced off it from the cameras. An active marker would be something like an LED light, so they will just glow by themselves and be picked up by normal cameras. An inertial system is the same kind of technology that's in like the Nintendo Wii or in your mobile device, where it moves, it reads where you're moving in space. So it doesn't actually need a camera to read you, it just needs a Wi-Fi signal. And so the benefit of that is you could put those suits on and take them out of the studio. You don't need to be where cameras are looking at you. You just need to be where you're reading Wi-Fi. The danger with that, though, by the way, as an actor, is it reads everything you do, and if they don't turn it off, it keeps on reading. So you need to be just really careful you don't, scratch your nose or, ask them to turn it off if you go to the bathroom, because otherwise if you walk out of the building or if you walk out of the room and go into a different room, it will see everything that you do. So it's just make sure you make that note.
Keep it in mind.
Keep
yes.
it in mind.
Good advice. So describe to us, so you were just saying that you can shoot mocap inside a studio, and that's, as we know, a volume. Describe what that's like and what does it look like and how does it capture the data?
So a motion capture studio is a really exciting place, actually. Quite often it will just look like a warehouse. You walk in and typically there'll be on the floor, the volume will be taped out. So the volume is the area where most or all of the cameras can see the markers. We call it a volume because it reads on an X, Y, Z axis. So there's your maths coming back into it. And so typically what you'll see is just a blank space. You'll quite often have the volume taped out. There'll be a cross in the centre, so you know where the centre is. There might be meters marked out as well, like a grid, because that becomes important later on if you're measuring your gait or your footsteps. And then typically there'll just be a whole lot of structures where the cameras are stuck on. Now there could be 10, there could be 50 cameras, depends on how big the studio is. But it will just look like an empty space for the most part. There may be elements of scaffolding around that we use for set, or there may be other structures that are built to look like set. If you are using an optical system though, all of those structures are likely to be just scaffolding and not solid set pieces, because the camera beam needs to better pass through them to read the marker and then back again. So it almost looks like one of those jungle gym playgrounds that you'll see, one of those climbing frames. And I think what's really exciting about that is it means that you're using your imagination as an actor. So you need to walk into this space and to be able to go, yes, I'm on a mountain, or this is lava, or you know, this is a tennis court. It's a very nice open space. It's almost like using green screen in the fact that there isn't any sort of real set. That's in an actual studio.
So shooting mocap outside, how does that vary? What does that look like, and what does that allow directors in terms of freedom?
Yeah, shooting mocap outside is something which there's actually good BTS footage of it for the Planet of the Apes, because I think they pioneered a lot of that work. The difficulty with it, you know, if you're using an optical system and the traditional sort of reflective systems, we're talking about the passive markers, is hard, because then you have to have, you know, how can you get all the mocap cameras out there amongst all the solid set and people on set, and, you know, can you control the lighting, can you control the weather? So there's a few techniques that I've seen used. Sometimes they'll use the active marker system, so they'll actually will have mocap cameras, but they'll use the LED lights. And there's great images of seeing, you know, people on horseback in motion capture suits acting alongside, you know, normal actors. So there's images of people in Planet of the Apes, I think it is, who are on horseback in their motion capture suits, right next to the live action characters. But another good way of doing it is using the inertial suit. So you still have to wear a suit, but because it actually just uses the wireless signal, you can be less worried about obstruction or occlusion. That's when the beam from the camera to the marker to the camera gets cut off by a solid object. We call that occlusion. So if you have an inertial system, which is just reading where the body's moving in space, then all you need is the wireless signal, and you can put that anywhere. So that you can do outside, and it works really well.
What about with stunts and fight? Like, sometimes you have to interact with objects, and do you record the data of those objects as well, or is that purely for performance?
So when we're recording stunts and fights, sometimes we will record objects and sometimes we won't, depends what we want to capture. We will tape up and marker up the weapons usually, so that we can see the weapons actually moving. One of the cool benefits though is if you're not wearing a suit and you haven't got a marker on you, the computer can't see you. So you could be fighting and then we need you to be thrown back. And if we hook you up to some aerial wiring, it won't see that. So you don't have to worry about being on set, filming and then, you know, removing the wiring later on.
Yep.
You can just capture the movement of whatever's marked up. It also means that if you have an object, someone could just pick it up and move it around and the computer will read that that's floating by itself. But you can get super creative. We did one once where I had to be walking on Mars, and you know, we did a bit of replicating me walking like I'm bouncing in low gravity, but then I had two other actors next to me. When I'd walk, they would start to just lift me. And so the computer just reads that I am just slightly bouncing as I go. So you can pick people up, move them around. You know, quite often when we're doing fights, you know, if you want to think about you're punching something, you can get someone just standing with a big punching pad and you can punch into that. So you can actually read
Got the pushback.
The pushback and the, you know, one of the things with mocap, there's a saying I have, which is mocap don't lie. So a lot of the fighting techniques we'll use on stage are deliberately designed to pull back out of the energy. So if I'm punching someone in the stomach, I'm deliberately stopping and not sending my energy into them. But if you do that on motion capture, then the system reads that's what you're doing because it's very truthful. So instead, it's actually better, rather than punching someone, it's actually better to get a big pad and you can just punch straight into that and the system will pick up truthfully everything that you do.
Okay, amazing. So why do you need a movement director, and when are they brought onto a production?
So a movement director, whether that's for film, mocap or theatre, is someone who specialises in how the body moves. So that might be for something as simple and rudimentary as a character. So how does that particular character move? It also might be for developing non-human creatures or animals, or for an actual movement sequence, which gets closer into dance choreography. But a movement director will be able to look at how an actor's moving and then work with them to change their movement so it matches that of a character. if you want to play a fun game, next time you sit in a cafe, just watch people walking down the street. And it's amazing how different everyone walks. And people quite often, when they're making new characters, will think, oh, maybe I'm overacting this, maybe I'm creating something which no one will believe. But you could actually get quite extreme movements that are still within our realm of normal. Quite often when I'm working with characters or with actors, I'll give them a scale. So like if 10 out of 10 is the most you can perform that technique, let's perform it at a 2 or let's perform it at a 7. You can genuinely see people who are walking along the street at a 10 in that they're doing that particular movement choice so strongly, but yeah, it's normal. So it's a really good character study to look at what people are doing. So that's what a movement director would help with in terms of a character sense.
Okay. And I read that you said you can do mocap well. Well, you can do mocap, but it's better to do it well.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
So technically anyone could jump in a suit and do the actions that they're asked for motion capture. To do motion capture well, for me, is about knowing how to use your body best in this particular medium. So it's understanding what is picked up, how it's picked up, and then how that influences the data and how that then influences the post-production pipeline moving onwards. So it's a lot of craft to do with how you move your body, how you use your breath, how you use your voice, how you use your imagination. So you might get one person who gets in the suit and you go, yeah, sure, you've done everything that we needed to do in that scene. But the second you get someone who knows what they're doing, you go, oh, wow, that looks genuinely like that looks incredible. That looks like it's really happening. The truth is in the detail always. So someone who knows how to create a detailed imaginative world and detailed movement and respond to that imaginative world truthfully will create a really fully fleshed and textured character. And in fact, it will actually give you the benefits of why you'd use mocap. So if you've got any old person in there who's not sort of trained and who does the basic outline of a scene, you might say, well, why would I use a person or why would I just animate that? Why wouldn't I just animate that? But if you actually get someone who knows how to bring full nuance into the performance, then you go, and that's why we're using mocap, because now we've got the texture and the nuance of life versus someone who's less able to bring that out.
So how does breath factor into performance?
So I find breath literally the key for performance, not just for motion capture, for all performance, but it's obvious in mocap when it's missing. And I know that sounds silly. I know you think, oh, but I'd always breathe. But trust me, you won't when you're performing and when you're nervous. If you want to have I love geeky stuff. So a geeky thing, the root word of animation is anima, which is Latin for breath or soul or life. That's also the root word of animal. So I love this concept that at the very heart of animation is breath. And I think as a performer, it's a really useful thing to recognise. You can use breath to communicate. So if you walk into a room and you're holding your breath, that's a different story to if you walk in and go, and so on a very base level, you can actually tell a story through the breath, but also it can help to define character. It can help to describe what kind of emotional state that you're in. But it also helps to free up movement. So there's a big difference in an animated character if I do a movement like that with a held breath versus then with voice as well. And all of these different additions of breath and voice will actually create what we're talking about in terms of the nuance of life for animation.
Wow, okay. So how do you get actors, as a movement director, how do you get actors to kind of get into that sort of zone and to release and relax, and why?
Yeah.
Why do you do that?
So one of the techniques I use to help actors relax actually comes from my background. I use a lot of Tai Chi and Qigong because it's a practice that Tai Chi and Qigong is a practice that looks at the internal landscape. So what I mean by that is where your tensions are in your body and how you are moving in an integrated sense as opposed to being locked up. So most people, when they're tense, the first thing they'll do is they'll hold their breath and they'll probably tense the body up like that. Now, as soon as you do that, if I do this, I've locked off all of the subtle movement that'll happen when I breathe and when I move that the cameras want to pick up. But if I can relax and release my muscles, and when I breathe, allow everything to just have a subtle amount of movement, that's what actually then creates the essence of life. So the first thing I'll do is train actors in how they can access their breath and how they can access physical relaxation. And that's the starting point. Once you get that, then you can start to get the more structured and directed, specific movement traits.
So how do you warm up for mocap, and what does a performer ideally want to focus on when they're going into character?
So when you warm up for motion capture, I would first of all start off just by finding the breath and finding a center. And for me, that's actually just standing still. And it's taking your mind around your body and recognizing where you're tense, where you're not moving quite so well, and just trying to find a nice, easy, relaxed breath. And to be fair, that's something which you can do for all performance, but it's particularly noticeable when you're not doing it in motion capture. From there, I would do like a normal, what I call joint mobility, to just go through, warm up all the joints in all the different directions, and then start to do the movements that you're probably going to do during the day. So if you're going to be crawling, making sure you do a lot of movements that warm up the shoulders and the wrists and the elbows. In terms of actually then accessing the characters, sometimes you'll be given an animated character ahead of time, and you know what you're going to create. Sometimes you're throwing one on the day. So then it's a matter of looking at that character and going, okay, so is it a human? Is it non-human? Is it fantasy creature? Is it real creature? So how would that creature move? And that's when we start to get into the language of movement for motion capture.
Amazing. So tell us a little bit about how and why you developed a language of movement for motion capture.
So when I very first got introduced to motion capture, I discovered it was the thing that I discovered that motion capture was the reason why I wanted to be an actor. It was this opportunity to get in what's basically a blank space. And it's like you're a kid in the lounge room with your friends or with your siblings going, okay, so the couch is a rock, the floor is lava, there's a monster over there, and you just play this incredible game of make-believe, and you use your whole body. You use all of your physicality, you use emotions, you use your voice and your imagination. So it's full commitment, although of course, obviously knowing that you actually are an actor in a room, you're not going completely, in the realms of make-believe. So when I discovered how exciting mocap was, I discovered it at a workshop I was doing in Canada. I was working with these two ladies, Michelle Ladd-Williams and Carrie Teal, and they were the ladies who designed the mocap movement for the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and did some workshops with them and was blown away by the experience. So at the time I was living in London, came back to the UK and thought, right, I want to train in this and I want to work in this industry. And then found there was nowhere you could train in motion capture. In fact, I didn't even know how to get into it. I didn't know how to access it. So at the time I was working with a stage combat company, and I had a group of performers who I worked with. So I ended up emailing every single motion capture studio in the UK and said, hi, this is who I am, a fight director and an actor, and I have a group of performers. I would love to learn how to do motion capture. Can I do a skills trade? So can we come down and do some work for you and explore? And in return, you can use us for whatever you want. And there was a guy called Alex Council from the Portsmouth University who got back straight away and said, yes, come down. They have an incredible setup there, and they're very invested in research and development. So we started a beautiful relationship where I would go down to research motion capture movement and performance, and at the same time then they would research their technology or use some of our footage in their BA animation courses, or for teaching their students how to work with mocap. So because there was this lack of training, then what I wanted to do was to research for myself, out of all the movement language and movement training I have, first of all, which aspects work best in this medium so that I know, but also then how would I teach that to other people? So I started to develop, some stuff was just movement stuff that's from other disciplines. Other stuff is stuff I've developed, but it's what I think works well and what lets a performer access really good mocap performance quite quickly. So it was developed out of a need to be able to train the industry, work with colleagues, but also so I know how to do the best work I can.
Great. So when you were in London and you first sort of discovered this passion for mocap, were there movement specialists working in mocap, or who were the people typically, I guess, shooting scenes using mocap technology?
Yeah, so the person who was most prominent, and probably still is Andy Serkis, because of the work that he'd done with The Lord of the Rings. And he is, of course, someone who comes from an acting background. In motion capture, though, as well, there's the very much the scene-based material, but there's also a lot of gaming work done. And what I've found is a lot of the people who are regularly working in mocap, perhaps in the more gaming sense, quite often actually came from a technical background. So maybe originally they were actually behind the computer and then said, no, but actually I've got martial arts, or I've got some acting training, I'll jump in the volume. And then a lot of them became actually then developed into what you call motion capture specialists. The people that I worked with, though, in the US, or I was in Canada at the time, came from a stunt, movement and stage combat background. So the language they used was very movement-based. From my experience, when we started to work with this language, that was when I personally received really good feedback from the groups that I was working with in terms of what you can get out of the system. So for me, that was the path that I took. I mean, I suppose the thing is there's a question as to whether there is such a thing as a motion capture specialist, because in one sense you can say, oh, it's just acting, it's just performing. I think for me, I agree with that. And also, though, you know, theatre acting is just acting, and film acting is just acting, and theatre small box studio is just acting, or open air theatre is just acting. In each of those situations, there's elements of your craft that you can highlight that best suit the work that you're in. So I find the same thing with motion capture. Yes, it's just acting, but there's things that you can do and go, well, I'm going to choose this part of my toolbox and bring that out, and that's what actually gets the best result at the time.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about what does the language of movement look like or feel like?
So for me, one of the things I drew on is a lot of the training that I had at drama school. So in a very basic sense, what I call like your weight. So where is the weight in the body? And I will talk about 3 places to put it on. Is it below the ground? Is it on the ground? Or is it above the ground? And that sounds quite abstract. But what it's talking about is if you imagine you're walking below the floor, then there's a drop that comes through the body. But if you imagine you're walking above the floor, then you just start to float up. And I call these, I kind of joke about calling them like apps in it, rather than me saying, oh, I'm going to sink my body down and make everything slow and heavy. That's a whole lot of instructions to think. But if I go, put your weight below the floor, then the body just organizes itself around that one thought. So it's a way to choose something very clear and very, very fast that the body can just grab onto rather than giving you too much to think about. Another thing I'll work with, so that's weight. I'll work with also lead point. So this is a very common acting technique, a lead point. So what part of your body leads the rest of the body? I like to get a bit more creative with it though. So sometimes we'll talk about, you know, do you lead from the head? Do you lead from the chest? Do you lead from the groin or from the knees? But I will say, well, what happens if you lead from like this point of your shoulder, or the back, or like, you know, the side of your head? And again, you know, and this is where we talk about scale. Like, well, if I do 10 out of 10 leading from the head, I might be like this. But if I do 1 out of 10, I might just be like that. And it's just a small thought, and it makes you other than yourself. And then that movement can start to inform story and inform character. Another thing I work a lot with is sensors, and this is developed from work. There's a lady in the UK called Gabrielle Maletta who does beautiful work in animal transformation that very much works from the inside out. And so you start to question, well, does my character mostly see the world, hear the world, smell, taste or feel the world? And again, if you're playing someone who hears the world, maybe it just puts something, a slight different attitude in the head, or a slight different way you respond to external stimuli, versus someone who sees the world, who, you know, again, maybe they're a bit more focused through the eyes. That becomes particularly useful once you're working with non-human creatures, so working with animals or fantasy creatures. So those are some of the things we'll start to pull in, and that's already 3 things to think about, you know, weight, lead point, sensors. Other things you can work with is tempo, so how fast you move, and the breath. You know, what kind of breath, where is it centered, how does it move through the body? And that's kind of, the main things that I'll use and kind of go, right, you can't think all of those, but just there'll probably be one and then maybe two that are really strong in rooting you in the character, and then you use those and then build from there.
When you have a new mocap role, what do you do to start getting into character, and what considerations are there?
So first of all, you've got to look at the actual size and shape of the character that you're working with. On a very technical level, for example, if you have a character whose body wall goes out to here and you put your arms against your own side, then that means you've made the animated character's arms go through its own body. So you have to be aware of where your boundaries are as a character. Or for example, like, do you have a long horn coming out of your head? So if you bring your arm through here, have you just taken your arm through your own horn? So sometimes with that, they'll actually put costuming on the character, whether it's just like a frame they put on them or an actual padded costume, or just something which reminds you, don't put your arm through your head horn. Other times then it might just be you recognising, no, I just won't drop my arms past this particular point. So in a very physical sense, you've got that. You've also got, okay, is it a quadruped or biped? So does it walk on 2 feet or on 4 feet or legs? If you're a biped, so a human type character, we can go down the line of going, okay, well, let's look at them and go, what would their weight, their centre, the lead point, or those movement directions, what would they be? If you start to get into quadrupeds, this is where it gets really interesting, because when you look at the different anatomy between a creature that walks on 2 legs versus one that works on 4, there's a lot of differences that are very hard to compensate for once you're creating a character. The pelvis usually tilts in a different way. I have a veterinary background, that's why. This is one of my interest points is you know, how you move differently from a 4-legged creature to a 2-legged creature. So the pelvis is in a different shape, the pelvis is in a different location, the spine-pelvis relationship is different, the spine-head relationship is different, your limbs are different. So in creatures such as a horse, for example, what we call the knee on the front leg is actually the same joint as the wrist. So as soon as you're a human trying to create that, first of all, if I bend over, my arms don't touch the ground at the same time as my legs. But even when I do, the way I move my forelimbs is very different to the way that a horse would move their forelimbs. So you have to then, again, in a technical sense, start to go, well, how are we going to deal with that? Do I pretend? Or do I get extensions like crutches and put my legs down? Or do I just put all 4 limbs on the ground and then get them to try and sort that out in post? So that's one of the really fun problems I think there with mocap, and it's actually an area I have a lot of interest in trying to work ways around it. An issue with if you end up having, you know, if I put stilts on the end of my on the end of my arms, not only do I not quite move properly like a quadruped, but also then I lose the benefit of having, you know, sensation and movement in the lower limbs. So that, again, does that undermine? Yeah, and it's like then, yeah, and this is the questions where you go like, you know, should we use mocap for that then? Do we use an actual horse? Do we mocap it as a human? Or do we actually just freehand animate it again? And, you know, so I think it's important to know when to use mocap and when not. What do you want it for? And if you identify what you want it for, and if that aligns with performance-based work, then probably good. But if you just want a horse running, then mocap a horse.
Okay. Probably a good point to talk about what a movement tree is and what's a movement tree used for.
Yeah. A movement tree is part of one of the really fun parts of mocap. So we use them when we're developing either crowd scenes or when we're developing gaming. So when you have a in-game character, they have a whole repertoire of movements that they can do. Every single instruction that you can make your gaming character do is something that has been generally recorded. So as the mocap actor, you have to record every single one of those. So we call these walking or gait cycles. So for example, how you would walk, but not just walk. You have to record stand to walk, then walking, and then walk to stop. But then you might do stand to run, and then run to stop. But then you might need to go stand to walk, to run, to walk, to stop. So every single thing that this character does, you have to record. And then you have maybe looking right, looking left, get down, swing a sword, do a karate kick or whatever. So there might be a bank of 70, 80, 100 or whatever specific movements. And what's really fun as the performer is they all have to pass through a point that means each of these moves can be mushed together. So you'd have your neutral position, your starting position, and that has to be super accurate so that every time you do a movement, you come back to that same position again. If you come back to a different position, what will happen is the character will move like this and then suddenly jerk back to its neutral again. So you have to be very accurate. So the way that is moved, the way that is used as a movement tree is then people can actually, have a whole range of movements they can use their in-game character to do. But when you're working with crowd scenes, they can actually then upload all of those movement options into a little AI character, and then that can just choose how it interacts. And that was actually developed for Lord of the Rings in a program called Massive. So all of the crowd scenes there, they're all little individual AI characters, and they're all doing their own thing. I understand that when they first started this, when they first populated the battle sequences and put the little characters in there, when they pressed go, they all ran away. So they had to adapt the personalities of the little characters to actually make them stay and fight. But if you look at the fringes, there's always one little character still running away.
Pacifists. Yeah. I love it. Oh, that's nice. So are there movement libraries and I guess what considerations are there as a performer in terms of your IP and issues around copyright for the ownership of your movement?
Yeah, this is a really interesting area. So a movement library would be actually and there's lots of these online. There's a bank where you can go, I need a punch, and you can pay whatever, 50 cents, $1, a couple of dollars, and actually already get the data of this is a character doing a punch, which you can then put onto whatever digital character you've created. And so someone created that at some point, that's good, and someone gets royalties from that each time they do that, you hope. There is a risk, a potential area of exploitation in Mocap of technically someone could use data that you record and use it for other things. And the reason why that's important is the way a performer would make their income is they get paid for their time. The commodity you use is your time, it's your skill, it's your training. So in that one moment, you record something. If it's then being used later on for something that you haven't given permission for, that's actually stopping another actor from getting work for that one thing, but also you should be getting paid for that. It's like someone basically, photocopying your artwork and just giving it to someone else or selling it to someone else. So it's a form of piracy. So it's quite an interesting area in terms of intellectual property because technically there's no way that you could technically prove that was you who created that work. So yeah, it's an area that I think is going to be interesting to watch as we move forward into this as to how you actually protect your own work.
So for students or I guess people that are sort of new to the industry and they're looking at a contract, would a contract generally say that the data is for perpetual use and that it's up to the discretion of the producer or director to use it for whatever purpose? Or how do you protect?
Yeah, to protect yourself, it's something you really have to look at the contract yourself. And if you're lucky enough to have an agent, they will be looking through that with you. Or just if you can't do it yourself or not confident yourself, get advice from someone else. I would just recommend reading it very carefully and just saying, what is this used for? Like if they have a total buyout on there, you are technically signing over your work to be able to be used for whatever it is. So you might want to actually say, no, I want a clause in here that says that this can only be used for this project and nothing else. If you're happy with a buyout, that's fine. You might go, oh, fine, it's a punch. You can use my punch. I don't care. Like it's up to you. But you do have to protect your own work and your own interest as a performer.
So how much collaboration do you have with the animators or the animation directors?
It depends how big the project is as to how much collaboration you have with the animators. If it's a very small project, you might actually have the animators in the room with you and it might be quite casual. And so you can chat to them about what they're doing. And I find that really interesting, actually. I think as a performer, it's really, really important to learn everyone else's role. That's regardless of film, theatre, whatever. Learn what everyone else does because you're all collaborating together. So in a small job, you can tend to actually talk to the animators and see what they've created. On a big production, you probably wouldn't talk to the animators. As the performer, you'd be talking to the director and the Mocap supervisor. Sometimes not even the Mocap supervisor. So The mocap supervisor would take care of the technical side of things. Then you have the director who takes care of the creative side of things. You might then have a movement director as well. It depends on the project. But generally speaking, the mocap supervisor would be in charge of saying, yes, that was technically good. No, we got occlusion. No, you dropped a marker. No, you went out of the volume, and saying whether on a technical level it works. Generally speaking, though, unless everything goes really, really messed up, it's the performance that wins over, so it will be what the director wants. So quite often you'll get a situation where the director says, that was the best take, and the mocap supervisor will go, sure, okay, fix it in post, which is a horrible thing to say. But then they'll be the ones who would then, liaise with the technical team. Quite often the animators themselves might not actually be in the room. It'll be the mocap tech team who's in the room. So the process that happens when you capture movement is that the data from the performance actually comes in the screen. It's just whatever those dots are if you're using optical system. That then gets attached to a skeleton that's been created, which gets attached to the character, muscles, skin, hair, clothing, everything gets added, and lighting. So there's a whole team of people. So the actual animators per se might not even be talking directly to the actors. But yeah, there's always a conversation that goes between the technical accuracy and the performance. And that's why I think as a performer, if you can understand how your actions translate technically, you can help marry those together.
You started Captivate Action, which is the first training company in London, which is now also has a base in Melbourne. So what sort of programs could students book into in Melbourne?
So in Melbourne, we regularly run stage combat workshops. So we run those as intensive courses or weekend courses, but also evening courses. Coming soon, there will be some motion capture training courses as well. We have done those in the past in Melbourne, but we're just in the process now of developing what we call the Performance Capture Intensive, which is usually like a 5-day training course, or it might even be an evening course coming up. So, we'll train people in how to do, I call it action for film, TV and mocap. So anything to do with movement performance and stage combat performance. Fighting with swords, it's always fun.
Yep, great. And I believe there's a new studio opening, the Dreamscreen with Clayton Jacobson's company in Melbourne.
Clayton Jacobson has started a company called Dreamscreen, which works with the LED screens. This is really exciting work. And in fact, I did some research and development work with them a couple of years ago. So basically this is where you have live action characters in the foreground and some set in the foreground, but there's massive LED screen behind that, which then has the background. The benefit of that is because then they can take that to any location. It was used a lot in The Mandalorian, for example. I think they used it recently when they were making Fires, and La Brea's been using some as well. And the benefit is that you can go to any location without having to transport the whole crew. But also then because you've got it's usually a slightly curved screen, that lighting from the screen actually also helps to light the set in the foreground as well. And it's very cleverly done. You can look at that image on the screen and you don't know that it's an LED background. But the work I was doing for that was very cool. So I was being a real-time character as an avatar on the LED screen. So when we were doing the work, I was at the very back of the room about 20 metres away from the screen. It then had the actors and the foreground set, and then you had the LED screen, and the real-time avatar that I was playing was directly on the LED screen. So whatever I did, this little character on the screen would be doing too. And it was very trippy. Like, I don't know about you, when I was a kid, I used to think that the TV characters were real and they just lived in the TV set, and when you turn it off, they'll go off and do their own thing. That was genuinely what I was doing. So I would just be standing in downtime and, putting my arms on my chest or sitting down, and then the character on the screen would do that. And even though I knew it was me, I'm like, wow, it's just chatting over there. So that's really exciting work, because then I could directly interact with the live action people in the foreground while being a digital avatar in the background. So the potential uses of that are, really opening up.
So it sounds like you had to employ your imagination very much in order to be able to interact with actors who weren't facing you as well.
Absolutely. And also just one of the things you need as a mocap performer is to be able to carry out very, very detailed technical accuracy, physical accuracy, at the same time as telling a story. So for me, I was in literally an area that just had, witches' hats around it, was taped off. There were people walking by doing their own thing offset. I had a blank concrete floor, that was my set. Whereas the actors down in the foreground had their makeup and their costumes and the set that they were working with. So for me, I needed to be able to keep an eye on what the actors were doing and what was happening on the screen, at the same time as imagining what was happening in my little concrete area space that the world I was walking in. But because my avatar was working in its own real world, if I took 2 steps that way, I might fall off a cliff. Or if I took a couple of steps this way, maybe there's a wall there. So I have to be able to work with very fine detail to know, no, I walk to this mark, I walk to this mark, I look down, I look up. But at the same time as making those actions look real and improvised and like the character's actually doing it. So if you go too far down the route of being too technical, then it just looks like someone's doing movement choreography. You need to be able to integrate that to story, so you just think the character's doing that just because that's what it wants to do.
It must make the job of the actors on the set easier, rather than acting with when I worked on Scooby-Doo, the Shaggy had a scene where he had to fight with Scooby and it was basically the visual effects data wrangler holding up a Scooby head, and so, yeah, he had to kind of pretend and act as though he was responding and getting hit and all those sorts of things. So I suppose for an actor on a volume where he's actually seeing the avatar, perhaps that eye lines and things like that might be a lot easier.
It absolutely helps. And it just, I know most actors are used to, knowing that, maybe I'm meant to be delivering a heartfelt scene, but it's to the corner of the camera lens because that's where my eye line is. And we are used to that, but also it's always much easier if you have something to interact off, and it just makes it more real. So yeah, it was really exciting actually to watch this, and I can't wait to see where this technology goes further.
So I've heard people refer to performance capture as well as motion capture. Is there a difference?
Yeah, so most people in industry now will say performance capture. I tend just to say mocap because it's quicker and easier and most people know what it is. Some people have started to say PCAP. I don't know if that's taken on or not. So when I say mocap now, I actually mean performance capture. So motion capture would be traditionally when you're capturing the bigger movements of the body and probably not fine detail, so not the face, maybe not even the finger movements. Performance capture is when you're capturing the entire performance, so typically would also be doing facial capture as well. Previously for facial capture, you can probably go online and have a look, they used to actually put markers on the face. Now the technology has improved so much. In fact, you use it now with your mobile devices, with Snapchat and that kind of thing, where it can actually scan the surface of the face and use that to actually then directly put onto the animated character. Facial capture is actually quite technical and quite difficult because, for example, you can smile but grimace, or you can frown but laugh at the same time. And there's all these really fine details that the face will do. And so a lot of the time now when you're working in performance capture, you'll actually have a helmet on with a little rig that has a camera sitting right here, which I'll be honest, I always accidentally hit. But it is quite interesting because you can actually then see, quite often you can see the image of what you're doing and you just see your face, which is very confronting. But yeah, that will be capturing all of your facial expressions at the same time as when you're doing the movement as well. And the technology now, generally speaking, they can put that straight onto a real-time character. They'll still go through post and they'll still, put it through the post-production pipeline, but they can actually translate it straight onto a real-time character. So you can stand and watch your whole body move and watch the animated character speak as you speak.
So how does that relate to game development, game making?
So in game development, motion capture is used in 2 main areas. One is to actually be the in-game character or the characters that they interact with. But there's also now for the scenes in between. And quite often for that, facial capture and voiceover are used quite a lot. So you might go in to do the physical performance, and that might be one actor, but then they might hire an entirely different actor to do all the voiceover or all the character voices, but also record facial capture at the same time for that. One of the great things about motion capture is that you don't necessarily have to have an A-lister do the work. And it's really exciting as someone who's an unknown performer, because it's a way that if you have a physical skill and you have an ability or a vocal skill, you can get a lot of work without having to worry about what do I look like, or am I someone who's very castable in this role in terms of your face. If your physicality is there, then you can get work. I did hear a story, though, that there was an actor who was hired to do facial capture, and it was quite a well-known actor, but apparently the day before they got Botox, so the face didn't move. So they came in to do facial capture and they couldn't use the material. So.
Oh, yeah, it's possibly something I didn't really think through, I suppose.
Yeah.
And you've just finished on Harry Potter and the Cursed Child on stage.
Yeah.
I know it's a theatre piece, nothing to do with motion capture, but as a performer, I guess what was involved with your role?
So on Harry Potter, I was the movement captain for 3 years and also one of the performers as well. So I had an ensemble track, which involved some aerial work. And also I covered 3 roles as well. So I covered Ginny and McGonagall and Umbridge. So my role would be I'd do my normal ensemble track, but if one of those 3 roles needed coverage, then I would jump up into that, and then I would have a swing who would then jump into my role and cover that. As movement captain, my job was to aid the movement director in taking care of all of the movement sequences in the show. So I would help to run warm-ups and run rehearsals and pass on notes. Also, I would receive notes from actors during the performance. So if something went a little bit awry, then they could tell me. I could write it down. They could carry on and focus on the rest of their show, knowing that I would pass the note back to the movement director. And then if it needed to work on it, we can work on it. For me, though, it was just an incredible experience to be on the show. It was everything I love about performance, because it was fantasy. You're at Hogwarts. We're doing magic, working to really fine technical precision at the same time as carrying through performance and emotion and using the body. It was so exciting. What I really learned from being on that show, though, is just how you can't get away from rehearsal and detail. There's no substitute. There's no fudging it. You just have to do it. So if something's technically hard, sure. So you rehearse it and you train at it. And, it was mind-blowing, the ability of the people on that show. You have actors who, at sometimes, particularly during COVID times, stepped up and did roles they'd never done before. And, would come in and we'll go, this is what you do. And they go, yep. And then they go on that night and do it. And you would never know. So I actually now have a higher expectation of the actors that I work with. When I go in as a fight director or a movement director, if an actor sort of says, oh, that's really technically complicated, I'll just say yes. And so you rehearse it. And it's the same, look, as a performer, it doesn't matter what you do, actually. Is it sport, or is it a language, or is it maths, or whatever? You just got to rehearse it. And if it's difficult, it just means you need more rehearsal. That's it, So I think, I hold now the profession to a higher account after having been on that show, because I've seen what people can do with hard work, and it is an incredibly hard-working company. The cast, the crew, the creatives, it's pretty special.
I look forward to seeing the new production.
I can't wait. I saw the dress rehearsal, so I've seen it a bit, but the opening night's in a couple of weeks, so I can't wait to see that.
Wow, sounds like you have some amazing experiences, and I'm sure you've got more to come. So
hopefully, thank you.
Yeah. So do you have any tips for students who might be looking into going into Mocap as a performer?
Tips for coming into this industry is to train in whatever you can as much as you can. This industry loves either highly skilled generalists or specialists. So for example, if you were in a tennis game, they want someone who's an extremely good tennis player, maybe a tennis pro. If you are a martial arts game, they want someone who's a pro or a very high level in that martial arts. So if it's for a very specific skill, then you need to be highly skilled in that area. But then they also might want people who are adaptable and what we'd call like physically literate, who can respond well to direction, who can be accurate, who can be fit. So for example, I understand that 2 of the actors who are playing elves in Lord of the Rings were gymnasts, martial artists and dancers, because within all that training, they can be elegant and move like elves, but I think also then they could be orcs as well, because they can change their physicality to become, heavy and rough. So train in as many movement disciplines as you can. If there's something that you love doing, train in that, because you're always going to enjoy it more. But just be curious. The more that you can encourage your body to move in different ways, the better. So if you're a dancer, train in a martial art. If you're a martial artist, train in dance. If you're a sports person, maybe train in gymnastics. So you keep on challenging your body to move in different ways. The other thing I'd recommend though, is to daydream and let your mind wander, because this discipline really needs a very active imagination. If you're working in a space that's completely bare, you need to be able to imagine in full detail everything that's happening around you, not just what you can see, what you can smell and hear and taste. So the more you can go, yes, I can see that clearly there's a giant there, and you can imagine precisely what that giant's doing, then you can respond off it. So the more you can sit and just practice imagining things, the better. There's a fun game that I'll play with my students, which is an imagination game, which is crossing two objects together that shouldn't be crossed. So for example, what does it look like if you cross a sheep with a tennis ball? And describe what that might be. And what's really interesting is when I say that, I instantly have an image of what that is. But it's fascinating that every single person will have a distinctly different, I thought my version was obvious, but yeah, yours is that. One of my students has one that it's a little tennis ball sheep and she just described that every time you hit it over the net, it goes, bah, bah. And so that kind of detail, or like another fun was crossing a dog with a teapot. Like what would that look like?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so that kind of, you can do that anywhere,
Yeah. What's the dream workshop you were mentioning?
So the dream workshop was talking about, letting your mind wander. Just one night, I quite often have very active dreams. So when I'm performing, I will think I'm performing, and when I'm choreographing, I'll try and choreograph work all night. And there's one night, quite often I have bad dreams about, workshops where I'm standing there and I'm asking people to do something and they don't do it. That's my anxiety dream about it. But there's one night I dreamed a workshop from beginning to end, and it was very odd because I'd very rarely do that. And it was in fine detail. And I woke up the next morning and I thought, that's either very good or very bad. But I wrote it down anyway. And it turned out to be good, and I still use it, and I call it the Dream Workshop. So it's just something which I made up when I was asleep, so that was nice of me.
Yeah. Thank you, Subconscious.
Yes.
It sounds like a super fun thing to do, but also challenging, and you've just given us so much insight into being a Mocap and movement director. So thank you so much for joining us.